If I'm in a city and I start at one point, decide I want to tour the city, move over, up, back, down, and so forth to get to this point, I have taken a very long path. I can imagine that path as being broken down, for instance, into all of the ups, all of the downs, and when I combine all of the ups, up, down, up, it would be the same as if I had just gone up. Similarly with the green. And if I combine all of the reds, that is, all of the ups and downs, and all of the overs and backs, I could imagine it to be just one path up and over, which has the same start and end point. This is an example of the combination of vectors, because this is an identical representation to this. Now, when it comes to the force table, we have vectors that are at angles. And in our case, we're only going to consider two vectors and how those two vectors can combine to form one vector, or how it can be represented by one vector. Here we have a vector coming up and a vector going over at those angles. As you can see, we could imagine this vector as coming over and up. We could imagine this vector as coming back and up, back and up. And just as we did before, we could take these two vectors and put them, my total over, my total up, my total over and back, and that would be the same as this. Because I start here and I end up here. The vector that I would fill in would go right here. The tricky part is, in the force table, we don't add tail to tip. Instead, in the force table, we start at the center, have one force pulling in this direction, another force pulling in this direction. We can imagine that this were shifted upwards so that it were to make a parallelogram like this, and so this would come up, this would come back. You can imagine the parallelogram being here, and the combination of this vector and this vector would be this vector, just as we had discovered here. I went from this point as my start, this point as my finish, this point as my start, this point as my finish, start and finish, this point as my start, this point as my finish. However we break down the vectors, the start and end points are the same. If these are force vectors, this vector combined with or added to this vector has a resultant of this vector. I could put these two together, or I could just substitute those two with this.